He was the wildest force in rock, cursed, chaotic, untouchable. But when death finally silenced Ozzy Osbourne, no one expected Robert Plant, the mythical voice of Led Zeppelin, to speak. For decades, he avoided the subject. Refused to even utter Ozzy's name. Until now. What he revealed after Ozzy's death has shocked the world, and it changes everything we thought we knew about the legends of rock. Before we uncover the hidden truth Robert Plant kept buried for decades, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because what you're about to hear isn't just a story. It's a revelation that redefines rock history. Don't miss a second. The world awoke under a veil of silence, the kind that settles only after the final curtain falls on a rock legend. Ozzy Osbourne, the Prince of Darkness, was no more. News of his death didn't spread like wildfire, it struck like thunder, cracking the sky of the rock universe in half. His legacy wasn't just music, it was madness, mayhem, a reign of chaos so profound it sculpted generations. Yet amid the grief-stricken tributes, viral montages, and candlelit vigils, one voice, perhaps the most unexpected, rose like a solemn hymn above the rest: Robert Plant. The golden god of Led Zeppelin had remained silent for years on anything to do with Ozzy. Theirs was a connection tangled not in friendship, but in rivalry, detachment, and an unspoken intensity only those forged in the fires of 70s rock could understand. Robert had heard the news on a late night, alone in his countryside home. He didn't shed a tear. Not immediately. He simply stood still, breathing in the weight of it. The man who once embodied excess and rebellion, who became the symbol of heavy metal, was now a name on a breaking ticker. Plant, always more poetic than chaotic, found the storm inside him surging in strange directions. It wasn't grief in the traditional sense. It was regret. It was memory. It was everything unsaid catching up like a freight train. Years ago, the world painted them in opposing hues: Robert the mystic, Ozzy the madman. Zeppelin and Sabbath, two storms that raged side by side but never collided. Fans pitted them against each other, the media exaggerated their distance, but the truth lay in subtle shadows. Robert admired Ozzy's raw magnetism, not the drugs or theatrics, but the defiance. The utter refusal to bow to anything. Even death, it seemed, took its time with him. And now that it had won, Plant felt the pull of something unfinished, something unresolved. His silence had always been deliberate. Robert had watched Ozzy from the corners of arenas, from sidestage shadows at festivals, from televised interviews where the wild frontman stumbled and screamed and still somehow captivated millions. He had seen the madness, the transformation from Birmingham boy to rock god, and though he never said it aloud, there was a part of him that had been in awe. But another part? Another part had judged him, the spectacle, the showmanship, the abandon. And that judgment, Plant now realized, had been rooted in envy more than disdain. The decades between their primes had softened some edges but widened others. While Robert had leaned into his folklore and Eastern philosophies, Ozzy barreled headfirst into television, into scandal, into a bizarre second life that turned his once monstrous image into a meme for newer generations. And Plant, ever the purist, had rolled his eyes. Until now. Now, none of it seemed funny. None of it seemed ridiculous. Because now Ozzy was gone, and only the myths remained. Robert hadn't spoken publicly about Ozzy for nearly 30 years. Not at award shows, not during interviews, not even when they were inadvertently booked on the same night at Madison Square Garden. But now, with the world on its knees in mourning, Plant did something he hadn't done since the Zeppelin reunion: he wrote. And when he did, it came not as a tribute, but as a confession. A raw, unfiltered exhale of things he had kept locked away. Robert Plant's letter spread like wildfire. In it, he didn't just honor Ozzy, he mourned the boy behind the madness. The broken soul from Aston who once stared at Plant as if looking at a god. That look had haunted Robert for decades. He confessed to never reaching out during Ozzy's darkest years, never applauding his resurgence, never acknowledging the force the Osbournes became. Not out of contempt, but fear. Fear that Ozzy's wild flame might burn brighter than his own. The letter ended with a haunting line: "You were the mirror I never dared to look into." And with that, Plant shattered decades of silence. Suddenly, the rock world looked back at photos, missed moments, nearly collaborated festivals, realizing how much had gone unsaid.
Quietly, Robert began appearing at memorials, a candle by Ozzy Star, a black rose in Birmingham. Then came Omen, a wordless sonic requiem, blending Zeppelin mysticism with Sabbath's weight. Fans called it a seance. It broke records and sparked a movement. Musicians finally spoke not just of Ozzy, but of the system that crowns gods and buries madmen without ever hearing their screams. Robert Plant didn't tour again after that. He declined offers for commemorative concerts, hologram collaborations, anniversary duets. He had said what he needed to say, not with words, but with truth. The silence he broke was never really about Ozzy. It was about the cost of being loud in a world that rarely listens until it's too late. Behind closed doors, he kept a photo, now an old, blurred picture of Ozzy from 1972, grinning like a kid, standing backstage with stars in his eyes. It had been mailed to him anonymously. On the back, written in messy ink, were 6 words that would stay with Robert forever: "We were louder than the world." And in the final pages of the journal Robert kept, his handwriting fragile but purposeful, he wrote a single thought: "He screamed for all of us." In the months that followed the release of Omen, Robert Plant's world narrowed. Fame didn't disappear, but it shifted. He stopped appearing on panels and declined interviews even from the most prestigious names in music journalism. He became a myth living among his own myths, a man who had nothing left to prove and yet everything still to feel. Behind the hedgerows and iron gates of his estate, he wasn't a legend anymore. He was just Robert, mourning not just Ozzy, but an entire era. An entire generation of rock gods crumbling into dust. His home became a shrine of sorts, though not to himself. Inside the music room, he began gathering artifacts: a worn-out copy of Paranoid on vinyl, an original Sabbath tour shirt, handwritten notes from decades past. Each item told a story that only he seemed to truly understand now. The contrast between Ozzy's volcanic chaos and Robert's haunting restraint played like a loop in his mind, 2 stars pulled by different gravity but birthed from the same burning sky. In his solitude, he returned to his journals. What began as letters to himself soon turned into letters to Ozzy, unmailed, unshared, but deeply revealing. He wrote about the festivals they never shared the stage on, the women they both loved from afar, the years when Robert felt forgotten as Ozzy rose again through reality TV. He admitted what had once been unthinkable, that he had been scared. Scared of Ozzy's complete surrender to the public, scared of what it meant to be consumed by one's persona. Robert had always tried to protect himself from that, hiding behind riddles and mysticism. But Ozzy had walked straight into the fire, laughing all the way in. One of the letters described a night Robert never told anyone about, a night in 1980, just months after Bonham's death. Alone, broken, and unsure if Zeppelin would ever return, Robert had wandered into a grimy bar in Los Angeles. And there, surrounded by people who didn't recognize him, he'd seen Ozzy, already deep in his own spiral, performing to a half-drunk crowd with all the power and pain of a man trying to outrun his ghosts. Plant watched him from the shadows, not saying a word. He left before the set ended, too afraid to be seen, too proud to be vulnerable. That memory, now fossilized in ink, was one of his greatest regrets. Time did not heal those wounds, but it made them quieter. It made them sacred. As autumn settled over the English countryside, Robert received a parcel wrapped in leather. No name, no return address. Inside was a single cassette tape and a note in Sharon Osbourne's hand. He wanted this to be heard when he was gone. Robert set up his old tape deck, the one he hadn't touched in years, and listened. Ozzy's voice, cracked with age but still unmistakably his, filled the room. The recording wasn't a song. It wasn't a rant. It was a confession. A goodbye. Ozzy spoke of fear, not of death, but of becoming invisible. He spoke of nights he didn't remember, of people he couldn't forget. He spoke of Robert, not with bitterness, but with awe. "You were the poet," he said. "I was the noise. But we were trying to say the same thing, weren't we?" Plant didn't cry. He just sat still, letting the silence at the end of the tape stretch on. He played it again. And again. Until he no longer heard the words, just the pain between them. That tape would never be made public. It wasn't for the fans, not for the charts, not even for history. It was for Robert. For closure. On the first anniversary of Ozzy's death, Robert Plant made one final public appearance. Not a concert, not a speech, but a single candle lit at the Royal Albert Hall. No cameras. No stage. Just a lone figure in the balcony, staring down at the empty seats, whispering something only the ghosts could hear. He never spoke of Ozzy again after that night. He didn't need to. The silence he returned to was no longer laced with judgment or fear. It was peace. A peace forged not by forgetting, but by finally remembering everything that mattered. And somewhere in the noise of a world that moved too fast to honor its icons properly, somewhere between the riffs of thunder and the echoes of a scream that changed music forever, Robert Plant had finally said goodbye not just to Ozzy, but to the part of himself he never dared to face. But time, as it often does, had one more twist prepared. A letter arrived months later, this time postmarked from Birmingham, written in uneven cursive, yellowed at the edges, and sealed with a pressed black feather. No return address. No name. Just 4 words written across the top of the parchment: "The other side remembers." Plant stared at it for nearly a day before opening it. Inside were pages, not typed, not formatted, just scrawled pieces of memoir, perhaps by Ozzy himself or perhaps by someone within his haunted inner circle. It chronicled the days when Sabbath and Zeppelin were kings of their castles, and the nights where they stood just feet apart at festivals, too proud to speak. It described Ozzy watching Robert on stage at Nebworth, whispering that he'd never seen anything so beautiful and hating himself for envying it. There was a photo tucked between the pages. A never-before-seen image of a young Ozzy and Robert backstage at a studio in the early 70s, each turned halfway away from the other, eyes glancing sideways, not in hostility, but in hesitation. It was like watching fate blink, too afraid to say hello. Robert studied the image long into the night, tracing the grain of the photograph, until it felt like the past was breathing beside him. The world had moved on, as it always does. New scandals replaced old tributes, younger artists claimed the crowns once held by giants, and the name Ozzy returned to whispers in vinyl crates. But for Plant, the noise didn't fade. In fact, it grew louder. Not in decibels, but in weight. Every guitar string he plucked felt heavier, every lyric he scribbled seemed like it didn't belong to him. Music was no longer the sanctuary it had once been. It was a graveyard of echoes, and every echo now wore Ozzy's shadow. Robert began waking from strange dreams of stage lights melting into fog, of screaming crowds turning into silent silhouettes, of Ozzy standing alone in the middle of an empty arena with his arms stretched wide as if daring the silence to swallow him. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't need to. It was as if the universe had found its own way of pushing them together, one dead, the other haunted. So, Plant did something radical. He began recording again. But not in studios, not under labels. He did it in his old attic using analog gear and battered tapes. No collaborators. No producers. Just him, the memories, and the ghosts. He called the sessions Ashes of the Empire. The tracks were moody, abstract, stitched together from guitar hums, reversed Sabbath samples, Zeppelin outtakes, and haunting wind chimes recorded in the middle of the night. It was not a tribute. It was a séance. And the world noticed. Quietly, Ashes of the Empire leaked through underground vinyl circles, found its way onto pirate radio stations in Berlin and New York, played late at night by DJs who swore it wasn't music, it was memory manifest. Fans began piecing together the sonic fragments, mapping them onto events from Ozzy's life, and decoding the messages hidden in the distortion. Some said Plant had buried his final message to Ozzy in track 5, in a reversed audio clip that when slowed down revealed a recording of their first and only phone call. Others believed Robert had sampled a scream from one of Ozzy's live shows and slowed it to sound like a chant. But Robert didn't confirm anything. He never would. He vanished into the folds of England's green valleys once more, taking the secrets with him. What he had to say had already been said, in strings, in silence, in the stillness that came after the chaos. Still, the myth grew. A documentary followed. Then a book. Then unauthorized biographies. All trying to explain what had happened between Robert Plant and Ozzy Osbourne, two men who barely spoke in life but somehow found communion in death. Scholars debated whether it was friendship denied or destiny interrupted. Critics claimed it was a fabricated rivalry turned poetic myth. But the fans, the ones who had stood in muddy fields, who had worshipped riffs as gospel, they knew the truth. This wasn't about two rock stars. It was about the soul of an era finally speaking its eulogy. And it didn't end there. A private collector revealed that Plant had commissioned a sculpture in secret, a towering structure of melted instruments and twisted mic stands, with a black crown carved from stage debris at its peak. It was hidden deep in a forest on his property, unreachable by road. No plaque. No inscription. But those who glimpsed it swore that on moonlit nights, the wind whistled through the hollow instruments in a way that resembled a Sabbath riff played backward. In one final, unexpected act of closure, Robert funded a quiet foundation under an anonymous name. It offered rehab scholarships for musicians battling addiction, providing treatment without judgment, echoing the years Ozzy spent battling his own demons. The foundation's only motto, "Madness has music, too." By then, Robert Plant had spoken all he would ever speak. The world didn't hear from him again. Not in the way it wanted. There were no more albums, no more interviews, no more surprises. Just sightings. A lone figure in record shops. A silent guest at gravesites. A man who once ruled the world now walking in the footsteps of someone who once screamed through it. But those who listened closely, those who placed a needle on a dusty record or rewound an old interview, they could still feel it, the tension, the sorrow, the beauty of a silence finally broken too late. Not every story ends in forgiveness. Not every rivalry births a friendship. But somewhere between a scream and a song, Robert Plant and Ozzy Osbourne had finally spoken, not through words, but through legacy. And as the final note of Ashes of the Empire faded into static, one truth remained, undeniable and eternal: some voices never die. They echo, forever, in the dark. Like and subscribe the channel for more updates.